I'd love him to resign if he wanted to. That explosive declaration echoed across countless screens and newspapers, sending a jolt through the heart of global finance. It was President Donald Trump himself, directing a barrage of criticism at Jerome Powell, the chair of the United States Federal Reserve. The sheer force of Trump's words, calling Powell stupid and insisting that his performance had been lousy, rang out like a clarion call, igniting debate among economists, market analysts, and everyday folks curious about how these high-level quarrels might affect their livelihoods. What is really going on behind these pointed remarks? And why should anyone outside the White House or the Federal Reserve care? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most consequential dramas in economic policy, President Trump's view that the Federal Reserve has refused to cooperate with him, especially in cutting interest rates as sharply as he wants. We will uncover how Trump arrived at these damning pronouncements, examine the potential fallout for markets at home and abroad, and consider the looming specter of a new Fed chair being nominated long before Chair Jerome Powell's term even ends in May of 2026. In this deep dive, we will also inspect the swirling names in contention for a possible future leadership role at the Federal Reserve, individuals whom Trump believes will be far more willing to reduce limits on money supply expansion and slash interest rates to historically low levels. So, buckle up, because this ongoing economic chess match may determine how much you pay for your next mortgage, car loan, or even the state of your retirement fund. In this episode, we will explore crucial questions. Will the president's inflammatory language truly undermine Jerome Powell's authority, even though Powell remains in office for several more years? How do the rumored candidates, Scott Bessent, Kevin Hassett, Kevin Warsh, and Christopher Waller, intend to steer monetary policy should they eventually take the reins? Are we poised to see yet another dramatic break from institutional norms if Trump effectively starts campaigning for Fed leadership changes well before the official process? And more importantly, do such moves risk politicizing an institution historically designed to remain somewhat insulated from electoral and partisan pressures? Stick with us as we venture into the depths of these issues, because the interplay between politics and central banking can have a ripple effect on the global stage. If you enjoy unraveling the hidden details behind decisions that can shake up your wallet, give this video a thumbs up. It helps others discover what is really happening in the often opaque realm of monetary policy, and it lets us know that you share our passion for bringing clarity to these high-stakes stories. Setting the stage, let us revisit that thunderous moment. President Trump, standing before microphones in a glossy press room, was asked whether he still supported Powell's tenure as chair of the Federal Reserve. Instead of giving a measured or diplomatic answer, Trump simply spelled out his dissatisfaction. He labeled Powell's performance as lousy, doubled down on criticizing the Fed's approach to interest rates, and explained that if Jerome Powell felt a hint of inclination to walk away from his post, Trump would be more than happy to see him disappear from the board altogether. That level of hostility between a sitting president and the nation's top central banker is not typical. Historically, presidents do express dissatisfaction with Federal Reserve chairs occasionally, but they usually opt for subtlety, well aware that the slightest hint of political meddling can rattle markets. Trump, by contrast, appears unconcerned with such niceties. His game plan is straightforward: reduce interest rates drastically, possibly plunging them to around 1%, because, in his view, that is essential to fueling robust economic expansion. By extension, any Fed chair unwilling to follow that line of thinking is an obstacle, not an ally. But why is the president permitted to nominate a Federal Reserve chair in the first place? Under the present structure, which has been in place for more than 100 years, the Federal Reserve is intended to remain independent from political influences. Chair Jerome Powell was originally appointed by Trump during Trump's first term, and that appointment was meant to span a 4-year term for the chair position, though Powell's board membership can last as long as the legal terms of service allow. This system is designed to maintain stability and public trust, safeguarding key financial decisions from the whims of partisan politics. The notion is that controlling inflation, setting interest rates, and modulating the money supply should not succumb to short-term electoral strategies. Yet, independence does not mean the Fed never interacts with the executive branch. It just means the Fed is not supposed to consistently bend its policies to appease any single politician. That principle of independence is currently being tested. Trump declared that he might name a successor to Powell very soon, a statement that rattled seasoned watchers of monetary policy. Powell's official tenure as the chair of the Federal Reserve does not expire until May of 2026, and his service on the Fed's Board of Governors extends even further, technically until 2028. Naming a so-called shadow chair suggests that while Powell continues in office, another person, personally aligned with Trump's perspective, could be preparing to replace him at the earliest available opportunity. Critics warn that this approach might simultaneously undermine Powell's ability to project a unified message on behalf of the entire Federal Reserve and cast doubt over the institution's credibility in the eyes of international and domestic investors. To understand how seismic this shift might be, we need to consider the role of the Federal Reserve in the global economic landscape. The Fed sets the benchmark for interest rates, which in turn influences everything from credit card APRs to corporate borrowing costs. If the Fed signals it wants to continue tightening monetary policy, that is, keeping rates higher, it might be in conflict with Trump's frequently expressed desire for lower rates to stimulate economic growth. For individuals, lower rates can mean more affordable mortgages, auto loans, and consumer credit. Corporations tend to jump at lower rates because it makes borrowing cheaper, which can increase their capital expenditure and stock buyback opportunities. However, a sustained environment of extremely low rates can accelerate inflation or create harmful asset bubbles. Trump's frustration stems from his belief that the Fed's refusal to slash rates far below the current range of approximately 4.25 to 4.50% is hampering his administration's ability to supercharge economic growth and remain politically popular. In a series of public statements, Trump has singled out Powell for blame, apparently convinced that the chairman's reluctance to incorporate the president's preference for ultra-easy money is preventing the administration from achieving the kind of booming economy that might ensure widespread voter satisfaction. Trump's calls for a drastic reduction to 1%, a level not witnessed for quite some time, has raised eyebrows among moderate economists who fear that it might stoke inflation, severely weaken the U.S. dollar, or push savers into riskier assets against their better judgment. Of course, even beyond Powell's future, there is the question of potential candidates lined up for the seat. Kevin Hassett is a name some watchers have floated, noting that he was a Trump advisor in the president's prior term. Another possibility is Kevin Warsh, who served as a Fed governor in the late 2000s, bringing with him a track record from the tumultuous days of the financial crisis. Scott Bessent, a well-known investor, has been rumored for a seat, though the swirl of possibilities remains rich in gossip and short on confirmation. Christopher Waller, who has also been part of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors and was initially appointed by Trump, has shown an openness to cutting interest rates. That alone might align him closely with the president's desires. But how might these candidates, should any of them be selected, shape monetary policy for the coming years? Well, if the president is adamant about interest rate cuts, that could push the Fed onto an entirely different course than the one outlined by Powell. Imagine a new wave of central bankers who are convinced that the best path to prosperity is to keep money cheap, very cheap, and lower the cost of borrowing. On one hand, that might boost stocks and corporate earnings, at least in the short run. On the other, inflationary pressures could surge if companies and consumers ramp up spending too quickly. Households with existing debt could rejoice in the short term, but therein lies a potential risk. If inflation accelerates or economic bubbles form, the subsequent crash could spread even more financial anguish. Indeed, it is a gamble that might pay off under certain circumstances, but one that could also introduce new kinds of turbulence to global markets. All the while, experts caution that politicizing monetary policy can strike a blow against the Fed's long-standing independence. Central banks in major economies, from the Bank of England to the European Central Bank, constantly strive to reassure markets that their decisions are based on data-driven analysis, not political convenience. If a Fed chair were installed specifically to parrot a president's desire for easy money, it could inspire suspicion among investors that official interest rate decisions are a product of personal loyalty rather than a measured approach to controlling inflation and stabilizing economic growth. Such suspicions alone can spur volatility because global markets, particularly currency markets, thrive on stability and predictability from the Fed. The availability of cheap credit might entice risk-seeking behavior among investors, while foreign governments might grow jittery about holding dollar-denominated assets if they fear future devaluation. We saw an immediate slice of that volatility on display when news broke that Trump might announce a possible early Fed nomination. The The US dollar index dipped around 0.3%, marking its lowest point since around February of 2022. Stock markets, in contrast, soared. Investors seemed to bet that cheaper money could bolster corporations' bottom lines. Watching your retirement savings fluctuate based on a mere statement from the White House highlights how interconnected politics and personal finances have become. And this is why we should all be paying attention. Now, you might be wondering, why does any of this drama matter if the seat does not actually become vacant until May 2026 or even later? The key is that monetary policy thrives on expectations. If the market perceives that Powell's authority is under threat or that his decisions could be overshadowed by a shadow chair endorsed by the president, then the credibility of the Fed's stance on inflation and rates might wane. With less robust trust in the bank's guidance, financial institutions could preemptively adjust their strategies. They might tweak lending rates, reprice assets, and shift capital in ways that complicate the Fed's ability to implement policy effectively. Put another way, the rumor alone can move mountains. That leads us to an intriguing dimension of the drama. Some insiders have begun describing the situation as a potential constitutional crisis in monetary policy. After all, the President of the United States has the power to nominate replacements for expiring Federal Reserve Board seats, but that timeline is generally respected to avoid chaos. If a president started flinging out replacements and expecting them to assume power immediately, the foundational notion of a Federal Reserve operating free from daily political meddling might be compromised. Of course, supporters of Trump argue that the Fed has not done enough to future-proof the U.S. economy, pointing to potential global slowdowns and new competition from emerging economies. They believe that slashing rates to around 1% could jumpstart growth and maintain the country's global competitive edge. Here is where you, dear audience, come in. These economic policies will determine the interest rates on your credit card, the mortgage you pay on your home, and the long-term returns on about every stock or bond investment in your portfolio. If you find this analysis helpful, consider subscribing to our channel. We have a lineup of in-depth discussions planned, and you will not want to miss our future coverage when and if Trump makes his official nomination for the Federal Reserve's helm. But let us not get too far ahead of ourselves just yet. Powell remains in the seat, and despite the inflammatory rhetoric, he has repeatedly indicated that the Fed's policies are guided by macroeconomic data, not presidential demands. He has cited the complexities of inflation control, labor market performance, and international financial dynamics that require careful calibration. While many central banks around the world have embarked on tightening campaigns, raising interest rates to keep prices stable, the president's disapproval highlights the challenges facing governments that wish to sustain vigorous economic performance. The tension has left observers wondering whether Powell can maintain the moral authority to actively guide monetary policy when the president is publicly assailing him and even hinting at an alternative placeholder. Some insiders worry about decision paralysis within the Fed if the staff becomes too focused on political repercussions at the expense of data-driven analysis. We should also consider the timeline of Fed vacancies. One seat up for renewal belongs to Governor Adriana Kugler, with a term set to expire in early 2026, meaning that a fresh appointment could begin the restructuring even before Powell's official tenure lapses. The mere possibility of a shift in membership might show up in the Fed's near-term deliberations, especially if governors suspect that a White House-backed appointee is just waiting in the wings. And though these concerns might sound somewhat theoretical for the average person, the ripple effects become tangible when you discover that currency markets pivot dramatically because of political speculation, or when inflation either creeps upward or downward depending on the Fed's direction. If we zoom out even further, we can see the broader historical context. Past presidents, from Lyndon Johnson to Richard Nixon, attempted to coax or coerce Federal Reserve chairs into adopting friendlier stances toward government spending and economic expansion. However, rarely have we witnessed such a full-throated, publicly broadcast condemnation of a sitting chair as we have seen from Trump. The confrontational approach spurs debates about how open a president can be in challenging what was meant to be an independent entity. Some argue that this kind of transparency, though jarring, is more honest. It reveals the intense struggle that has always existed behind closed doors. Others claim that these public outbursts weaken institutional integrity, degrade America's image abroad, and risk making the U.S. look erratic or uncertain in its policy commitments. On that note, it is essential to remember how global financial markets react to perceived cracks in the Federal Reserve's independence. The value of the US dollar is tethered to market confidence in the central bank's ability to control inflation effectively and maintain orderly markets. If traders interpret the Fed as a puppet of the administration, the trust that underpins the dollar's role as a global reserve currency might be eroded. Even a modest dip in that confidence can lead to capital flight, unpredictable exchange rate swings, and potential long-term damage to the U.S. economy's stability. This fear may sound exaggerated, but we have historical precedents in other nations where government attempts to strong-arm central banks have triggered investor anxiety and, in some instances, financial crises. The U.S. typically holds a steadier course, but that resilience is contingent upon consistent, rational policymaking. We should also not neglect the possibility of an ideological shift at the Federal Reserve's core. Although Powell has been a more moderate figure, particularly concerned with stable inflation and slow but steady interest rate readjustments, a new wave of dovish leadership could usher in policies that aggressively facilitate easy borrowing. This might sound appealing for a short while. Indeed, stocks or property values might surge as corporations find money cheap, and households can refinance mortgages at incredibly low rates. But there is the classic tension. What if the economy overheats? Past experiences show that letting growth run too hot can feed future recessions. Why? Because a burst of inflationary momentum can cause the Fed to slam on the brakes suddenly, with steep rate hikes, which destabilize markets more than if the Fed had maintained a careful, gradual approach. This cyclical whiplash can bruise ordinary people, from prospective homebuyers to retirees. Yet, in Trump's eyes, those concerns take a backseat to the immediate objective of jump-starting or sustaining robust economic performance, especially if he wants to secure political capital and popular support. To him, the Fed's refusal to speed up interest rate cuts indicates a lack of cooperation that might even border on sabotage. Political watchers wonder if Trump might leverage every legal mechanism available to position a loyal candidate well in advance, effectively heralding a replacement who stands ready to reshape policy the moment Powell's official term expires, or even sooner if Powell chooses to resign under the mounting pressure. At this juncture, we come full circle to the rhetorical question: is there a possibility that Powell will indeed walk away before his term ends? So far, there is nothing concrete suggesting Powell intends to do so. Publicly, he has maintained composure, indicating a willingness to stay the course and fulfill his sworn duties. The Federal Reserve tends to operate under a sense of duty that transcends mere personal pride, emphasizing service and continuity for the broader good of the financial system. Given these traditions, it would be unprecedented for Powell to vacate the role simply because of repeated insults or attempts to undermine his reputation. Nonetheless, the intensifying clash with Trump is bound to wear on even the most determined official. As market participants map out hypothetical timelines, many note that a formal replacement process usually takes months, involving Senate confirmations and thorough vetting. If Trump nominates someone significantly more hawkish or dovish than usual, the political friction within the Senate could balloon. In other words, it is not as simple as snapping one's fingers to replace a central banker. Still, the president wields substantial influence through the bully pulpit and the nomination process. Observers wonder if that alone might be enough to cast a shadow over Powell's remaining time in office. This chess match shows no signs of abating. We watch to see how the Fed maneuvers in its upcoming meetings, particularly around July or later in the year, when rate decisions become a hot-button topic. Will the Fed yield to political pressures, even subtly, or can it keep forging its own data-driven path? If the economy wavers, if inflation spikes unexpectedly, or if growth stutters, each outcome provides new ammunition for either side of this battle. Trump will almost certainly seize on any vulnerability as proof that Powell lacks the vision to secure prosperity. Meanwhile, Powell's defenders will highlight every negative repercussion of artificially low rates to demonstrate that the Fed's caution is indeed justified. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watches. Global financial hubs, from London to Tokyo, pay keen attention to Federal Reserve signals because the value of the dollar influences trading patterns, bond yields, and even commodity prices worldwide. If Washington's internal politics begin to corrode faith in the U.S. central bank's measured approach, it could embolden other systems or spark broader questions about the reliability of the dollar-dominated financial system. For now, the U.S. remains a cornerstone of global finance, but unpredictability at the top can sometimes sow seeds of international doubt. Where do we stand by the end of all this? A precarious and highly charged situation is in play. On the one hand, we have a president who is fiercely determined to realign monetary policy more closely with his personal convictions and political motivations. On the other hand, we have a central bank leadership that regards its own insulation from those very motivations as essential to doing its job effectively. The collision of wills could result in a reshaped Federal Reserve, fresh appointments, and an environment in which interest rates are slashed, perhaps quite drastically, in the near future. Or, the standoff might lead to a redoubled effort by the Fed to assert its independence, setting up a high-stakes power struggle. And ultimately, the entire populace stands to gain or lose depending on how this conflict is resolved. For those of you who have stuck with this extended analysis, thank you for delving into the complexities of this moment in financial history. If you found it intriguing, make sure to give us a like. Your input encourages us to go deeper and tackle future topics with the same level of detail. Because, believe it or not, decisions made by a handful of officials in Washington can and do send shockwaves through local communities, small businesses, large corporations, and just about everything in between. We appreciate you joining us and exploring how the puzzle pieces fit together, and we look forward to bringing more clarity and perspective as the saga unfolds. As the dust settles for now, we are left with more questions than answers. Will Jerome Powell stand firm in his post until May of 2026 or beyond? Will Trump make good on his promise to nominate a like-minded replacement very soon? How will the tug-of-war between short-term political expediency and long-term macroeconomic stability shape the Federal Reserve's strategies? And might these developments alter how the world perceives the United States' capacity to manage its own monetary policy? Keep an eye on these stories as they progress, because the interplay of politics and money is never just a sideshow. It is the main event that can reshape the fortunes of countless individuals, industries, and indeed, entire nations.